Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Today, politics in the time of coronavirus. I'm President and CEO Kim McClary, and I am so appreciative of your ongoing participation and support. Please stay tuned at the end of the program to find out how you can help support us, as well as hear a terrific lineup of upcoming programs. For those of you who want to submit questions to Dan, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of the screen where you can submit your questions. Jessica will be getting to as many of your questions as she can in about 20 minutes during the Q&A portion of today's program. It is now my pleasure to introduce politics professor Dan Schnur and his weekly series, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Dan has three terrific topics for you today. Of course, the Biden-Trump debate and a recap of that. He's also going to be touching on Amy Coney Barrett and whether or not she's the newest Supreme Court justice, as well as the future of the Electoral College, pros and cons. Dan, we can't wait for another stimulating discussion. We need your guidance. Thank you.
Well, Kim, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you, as always, for joining us. As I was getting ready for today's program, I realized that for some of us, and I know our audience has grown every week, which is very, very exciting. But at least for some of you, we've been doing this for almost exactly 6 months now, since the pandemic first shut down our in-person meetings. And we've covered a lot of ground over those months. And here we sit now, just a little bit more than 30 days from Election Day. And I think it's worth just sort of remembering why Kim and her colleagues decided, and why I was thrilled to help in putting together a program like this. As all of you know, in much of media, on cable, on radio, online, so much of the conversation is very angry, it's very vitriolic, and of course, it's very bitterly partisan and very, very divisive. And so what I like most, and I hope that many of you do too, is being able to come here each week for an informational and an analytical conversation, knowing that all of us have very strong feelings about the candidates, about the parties, about the issues being debated, but at least for an hour a week we can come together and have a rational conversation about what this all means and what we can learn as we watch the election season proceed forward. I know as we get closer to Election Day, like I said, we're barely 30 days out now. There's a lot of heightened emotions, a lot of concerns, and even some panic in some quarters. And I guess what I'd offer, and we can talk more about this in the weeks ahead, is we'll get through this. I've recommended to you before a wonderful book, and I'll mention it again today, a book by the American historian John Meacham that came out just a few years ago. Meacham wrote a book called The Soul of America, The Soul of America. And what Meacham talks about in that book is how that the challenges we're facing now, particularly the huge divisions in our society, the partisanship, the polarization, he said this is nothing new. This is something we've dealt with in this country since before we were a country. And the really phenomenal thing about the book is not only does he remind us of some of those past challenges that we've faced and successfully confronted, the best thing about the book to me is he tells us that the way we got past those challenges in the past isn't just with great leadership, but a term that I'll use that I don't think he does, not just great leadership, but great followership. In other words, good men and women who stand up during times of strife and division, who stand up for what's right. And that's how we've made it through in the past. And I suspect that as bitter and as angry as the times are going to get in the weeks ahead, I think if we remember those lessons from our own country's past, we'll be just fine. We'll be just fine going forward. We'll talk more later today. I know when we get to questions, we'll talk more about some of the charges, some of the more outlandish statements that are being made about voting, about the post-election day period. And we can talk more about what to do then, and we will talk about it again in the days and weeks ahead. But for now, let's get to the topics. And as Kim mentioned, no surprise at all, topic A this week is Tuesday night's presidential debate. And before I offer my thoughts on it, which of course I will, I'm going to ask all of you 2 questions, and so if Claire can help me. Question number 1, just simply, did you watch Tuesday night's presidential debate? Yes or no? And we'll talk a little bit more about what we saw. But frankly, I'm just interested in seeing how many of you took the time to tune in for at least some, if not all of it. And in retrospect, Claire, this is my fault. Maybe we should have asked a all, some, or none set of options. But let's see what our binary responses were. What did we get? Not surprisingly, a well-informed, educated group like ours, 89% watched, 11% didn't. So the second question, and this will get into the topic we'll be discussing in just a minute or two. Now that we know that the overwhelming majority of you watched it, here's the second question. Will you watch the remaining debates? Yes or no? The vice presidential debate between Mike Pence and Kamala Harris is next week. Then 2 weeks from tonight will be the second presidential debate. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then the third and final debate will be 3 weeks from tonight, not too long at all before the election. So let's see how viewership is going to go going forward. Well, not nearly as much of a drop-off as a lot of the commentariat has been predicting. As most of you have read, there's a widespread expectation that's so unfortunate was the nature of Tuesday's debate that many people would decide not to watch. But at least for this group, I give you a lot of credit for putting the importance of being informed over what our tendencies and our instincts might be under other circumstances. Okay, so let's talk about the debate. So I've only been doing political campaigns since 1984, so I'm pretty new at this. And I've never seen anything like it, and I think that's because there never has been anything like it, at least not at the presidential level. One candidate called his opponent a liar and a clown and told him to shut up. And that was the more civil of the 2 candidates. But I'd offer you this: if we take a step back and away from the debacle that took place on stage Tuesday night and look at its broader impact, I'm going to offer you this assessment. In the first presidential debate of the 2020 general election campaign, nothing happened. At least nothing happened that will change the direction of the trajectory of the campaign. In other words, here we sit a couple of days after the debate ended, and nothing really has changed. New topics have come up, and we'll be talking a lot about white supremacy, about mail voting, and other very inflammatory topics in the days ahead. But in terms of the overall direction of the race, nothing changed Tuesday night, I suspect, at all. Neither candidate, in my opinion, was particularly strong. Trump was obviously very belligerent and overly combative. But it wasn't Joe Biden's best night either. I think he got frustrated. Trump clearly got under his skin. And Biden, when he's not at his best, tends to frequently get lost in his own answers. And I think he left a lot of very good opportunities for himself on the stage when he wasn't able to articulate his argument to the degree that I think he would have liked to. I don't think that either one of them won any new supporters on Tuesday night, but both motivated their own bases simply by not being their opponent. The good news for Trump is he now knows that neither an opponent or a moderator can stop him from being Trump on a debate stage. The good news for Biden is that Trump being Trump doesn't move any votes in the president's direction. And since the next debate, as I said, doesn't take place for another 14 days, 2 weeks from tonight, that means the campaign, in all likelihood, is going to be largely frozen in place until less than 3 weeks before the election day. And knowing that early voting has already started in many states, including in California, just at the end of this week and early next week, not only does the lack of change in the campaign keep the overall debate from potentially changing the outcome, but every day votes are being cast. And it's going to be at least 2 weeks, I think, before anything might happen that's going to change the nature of that voting. So what did Biden do on Tuesday night? I'm going to use, and it often drives my wife crazy when I use sports analogies, but I'm going to use a boxing analogy for just a minute. If there are any of you who are boxing fans, particularly boxing fans with long memories, you may remember many, many years ago when Muhammad Ali was still fighting. He regained the heavyweight title in 1974 in a fight with George Foreman. And the fight was known as the Rumble in the Jungle. Foreman was a very strong boxer. In other words, he's a much powerful boxer. He's a much stronger individual than Ali was. And what Ali employed was a technique that Ali called rope-a-dope. Rope-a-dope. And what that means is that Muhammad Ali allowed Foreman to just continue punching him repeatedly over and over. And so Ali covered up his face and his head so he couldn't get hurt. But he allowed Foreman to keep landing body blows, punch after punch, round after round. Because Ali knew that Foreman would exhaust himself before his punches caused him any great harm. And over the years, many other fighters have learned that if they could withstand their opponent's blows, they might leave some of their own blood in the ring, but they'd ultimately prevail. And I would suggest to you that that's what Joe Biden did on Tuesday night. Biden punched back on occasion and occasionally offered insults and criticisms of his own. But Biden knew going in, he was clearly very well prepared for the debate. He knew that Trump's nastiest attacks, even if he might not have expected the magnitude of them, he knew that Trump's nastiest attacks wouldn't win the president any new supporters at all. So rather than going toe-to-toe with him, Biden absorbed the worst of Trump's hits. And you may have noticed, often didn't even address the president or the moderator. I would argue that Biden's best moments were when he turned into the camera and directly addressed the American people, at least for a few moments, keeping Trump out of the discussion altogether. And so Trump landed a lot of punches, but there's no indication that they harmed Biden. And if you're Biden and you have a lead with 30 few days to go in the campaign, then that's good enough. Now, Biden did let Trump get under his skin a few times. And I think he knew going in, Biden did, that if he simply ignored Trump, that wouldn't play all that well either, because Trump has frequently derided Biden as being weak. And so there were times when Biden did need to stand up for himself. But he did seem off balance. And it's pretty clear to me that President Trump knew that confrontational, that aggressive of his approach could throw Biden off of his game. And it did on many occasions. The other thing that Trump knew with that kind of approach is he knew, or at least his advisors knew, that going that aggressively at Biden and interrupting so frequently wasn't going to win him any supporters. But as we've known from the very beginning, we've been talking about this since our first webinar back in March, Trump's strategy is based on the idea not of persuading undecided voters to support him, but motivating his strongest supporters. And what the president and his advisors understand is that those kind of attacks on Biden, those kind of interruptions, that kind of belligerence, not just toward his opponent, but toward the moderator, it's a terrific way, a very effective way for Trump of exciting his own base. And so while he didn't win any new converts over, I don't think, that wasn't his goal. He rallied his own base, and that was good enough. Biden, on the other hand, as we've talked about for months now, knows that his key to victory comes primarily from persuading undecided voters, particularly those centrists, particularly those working class voters who Trump took away from Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. And just like Trump's debate was a 90-minute distillation of a base motivation approach, what we saw from Biden on Tuesday night was a reflection of what he's been doing for months now, concentrating less on his Democratic progressive base and more on those voters in the center, and trusting that the kinds of things that the president says and does will motivate progressive Democrats in a way that Biden himself doesn't have to. So those are my thoughts, and I'll be eager to hear your questions in just a few minutes. But in the meantime, I have another question for you. Question: have the presidential debates outlived their usefulness? In other words, should we find another way of exposing the voters to the candidates in a way that can provide us useful information about them and their goals and their agendas? So the options we have for you here is yes, the debate should be discontinued. These aren't serving a useful purpose anymore. Number two, the debates should be replaced, but they should be replaced with back-to-back candidate interviews in which journalists or moderators can ask them questions about the issues of the day and about their own histories and their own goals. Third, should this format be replaced with back-to-back voter town hall meetings, where rather than journalists or moderators, voters ask one candidate or the other question, and then instead of having them on stage simultaneously, having them answer those questions sequentially. Or finally, no. Last Tuesday night was strange in all sorts of ways, but the debate should be continued to be held under the current format. So Claire, let's see what we got. Okay, 5% say we ought to discontinue the debates altogether. And after that, we got pretty much of a split decision. 27% say that the debate should be replaced with back-to-back candidate interviews sequentially rather than simultaneously. 35% say they should be replaced with sequential voter town halls. So if you add that up, 62%, almost 2/3 of us, believe that having the candidates on stage together is not as useful as giving them a chance to be questioned, whether by journalists or by voters, one after another. And 34%, still a strong minority, said let's keep holding them under the current format. It is worth noting, just for a moment, that the debate 2 weeks from tonight, the second presidential debate, will be a different format. The debate on October 15th will be a town hall meeting, and while Steve Scully from C-SPAN will be moderating, the questions will come from voters. And so it'll be interesting to see, and we'll talk more about this either next week or the week after, and certainly the week after the debate, about whether Trump decides that being as combative toward audience and voter questions makes as much sense as the attitude he displayed in dealing with Biden and Wallace this week. So let's move on to our second topic. Let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court, because when we met last week, we didn't yet know who Trump was going to nominate as the newest Supreme Court justice. It's a little bit disconcerting to me. I'll admit I had to go back and check. I had to go back and check to find out, was it really only 5 days ago that Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett to the court? And the answer is, of course, it was. Last week, even though we knew Barrett was the strong favorite, we were still discussing whether she or Barbara Lagoa, the judge from Florida, would become Trump's nominee. And it is worth reflecting, it's worth looking back on those two alternatives, because it tells us a lot about the choice that President Trump made. So what did Barrett and Lagoa tell us about the president? What were the options available to him? Well, Amy Coney Barrett is from the Midwest. She's from the state of Indiana. Barbara Lagoa is from Florida. And many of Trump's political advisors were arguing to him that he should pick Lagoa because Florida is such an important state in this election, whereas Barrett's home state of Indiana is not, but also because Lagoa is of Cuban American descent, and they felt it might help Trump with Latino and Latina voters. Amy Coney Barrett, on the other hand, his advisors felt, could be of great help with working class voters. And as a Catholic from the Midwest, they felt that a lot of religious conservatives, fundamentalist and evangelical and conservative Catholics who are not as enthusiastic about Trump now as they were 4 years ago, could become remotivated now that if Barrett became his nominee to the court. More important, Barrett is a social conservative. who has made publicly over the years in her statements and her writings very clear position on any number of issues, including the issue of abortion. So Barrett is very much of a social conservative, where Lagoa is much more of a pro-business economic conservative. And then most importantly, I believe from the president and his advisors' perspective, Barrett is what they would consider to be a very reliable known quantity. She's been writing and speaking on these issues for years, and they have no doubt whatsoever that she will be a reliable conservative vote on the issues that are most important to their supporters. And while Lagoa is very highly regarded in conservative circles, she has a less extensive record on the bench and in public statements and writings. And for a Republican conservative base that over the years has seen David Souter and Anthony Kennedy and sometimes even John Roberts let them down, a known quantity like Barrett seemed like a much safer choice. So what we have here, geographically, demographically, and ideologically on each of these is Trump looking for a justice who could motivate his base in this election, as opposed to reaching out to new voters or swing voters in contested states. So we hope, of course, that the decision was made not for reasons related to the 2020 presidential campaign, although Trump himself has indicated that that was part of his thinking. We hope that's not the only reason that the pick was made. But in terms of the political ramifications of the choice, on every single one of these matters, Barrett represents someone who can help Trump reinforce his political strategy of motivating existing support rather than reaching out to undecided voters. Now, we know, as we suspected last week, we know that Republicans have the votes to confirm Barrett. Only 2 Republicans of the 53 have indicated they don't think the nomination should go forward. And so, barring something very, very unforeseen, it's pretty clear that Barrett will be confirmed. The outstanding question is when. Because while Democrats cannot stop the nomination from proceeding, they simply do not have the votes in the Senate. There are various delay tactics available to the minority in the United States Senate, and Senator Charles Schumer of New York, the Democratic leader, has made it clear he intends to use as many of those techniques as possible. So the Republicans, in order to get this done before the election, are working on a pretty tight timeline. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearings will start on Monday, October 12th, a week from Monday, which is a very accelerated, but to be fair, not an unprecedented fast turnaround. The hearings will go for a few days, the week of October 12th. Then the week of October 19th is when the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Lindsey Graham, intends to call the committee vote on whether the committee should recommend Barrett's nomination to the full Senate. And then what is currently tentatively scheduled is a vote by the full Senate the last week of October, the week of October 26th. And so without any delays, without any slowdowns, without any unexpected circumstances, under the fastest possible circumstances, Barrett becomes the newest Supreme Court justice less than a week, just a matter of days before the election. And what we may see is Schumer and his allies in the Democratic Senate trying again, not to derail the nomination because they probably can't, but to see if they can delay it enough to have it wait until after the election, because their thinking is, with some potential justification, that if any of the Republican senators running in contested races for re-election this year lose their re-election campaigns on November 3rd, they might be, emphasize might be less likely to cast a loyal vote along with the president if they know that their own careers in the Senate are over. So the question now becomes, how do the Democrats conduct themselves over the next few weeks? Do they look reasonable? Do they look respectful? Do they treat this as a hearing would be under less unusual circumstances? Or do they make it clear how unacceptable they find the president's decision to move forward? So Claire, let's ask the next question of our group. One specific question about how the Democrats should conduct themselves in the weeks ahead. Should Democratic senators meet with Judge Barrett prior to your confirmation vote? Senator Schumer has said that he will not. Many of the Democrats, although not all on the Judiciary Committee, have said that they will. What do you think? Is it a good thing for the Democratic senators to meet with Barrett even though they disapprove of her nomination? Or in order to express their disapproval, should they not? Let's see what the answer is. Well, 85% believe Democratic senators ought to meet with Barrett before the confirmation vote. Really interesting, very, very interesting answer. The one thing that we're not going to have a chance to talk about today, at least as it relates to Barrett, and I suspect, and I will also apologize because it looks like our conversation on the Electoral College may have to wait for another day, is what I'd like to do, and perhaps we can do this once the committee hearings have started, is talk in particular about the very highly charged issue of abortion and what that means in the context of this nomination debate. And so for those of you who are filling out your schedules for next week, I hope you'll set aside next Thursday at 11. And what we will do is not just talk about the nomination more broadly, but particularly talk about it particularly on that critically important issue. But before we wrap up this part of the program and go to your questions, which is my favorite part, I'm going to ask you one more question because Barrett is very, very devoutly Catholic. She is very determinedly pro-life. And there's been some controversy, just as there's been some debate about whether Democrats should meet with her or not. There's been a lot of argument about whether Democratic senators should ask Barrett about her religious beliefs in the Judicial Committee hearings. Our own Senator Dianne Feinstein has taken some criticism by the way she raised that issue when Barrett was confirmed to her current seat a few years ago. But knowing that this is the jumping off point into a discussion we'll have next week about the issue of abortion in the context of the Supreme Court and potential future rulings, what do you think? Should Barrett be asked about her religious beliefs or not? What have we got, Claire? Oh, 73%, almost 3/4 believe she should be asked about her religious beliefs. Only 12 and 27%, barely 1/4, say no. It's worth noting, and we will talk much more about this next week, that the president and his allies are hoping for a moment like the one that Senator Feinstein provided a few years ago, in which, in questioning Judge Barrett about her religious beliefs, that the senator or senators in question somehow come across as looking religiously intolerant. And for a Trump re-election campaign that very badly needs to win back Catholic voters that it's been losing to Biden over the course of the year, that's something they're hoping for very, very profoundly. So once again, my apologies that it looks like our conversation about the Electoral College is going to have to wait a week, but I hope you'd agree that given the other topics we had, the debate and the Barrett nomination, it was worth spending a little bit more time on those two topics. And so next week we will, we've got at least 2 of our 3 set, Jessica. We can come back to the Barrett nomination as it relates to abortion rights and abortion law. And then we can talk about the Electoral College again, which means you and I only need to figure out one more issue for next week. We're almost done.
Well, thanks. That makes things easy.
In the meantime, though, I'm wondering if anybody has raised any questions since we started the program.
There have been so many questions coming in. It's going to be hard to get through as many of them as have come in, but I know that you will do your best, and I'll try to combine those that I can. Our first question is, you're speaking of a binary perspective, and I think this is in regards to how Republicans and Democrats viewed the debate. What has been the impact of the debate on independent or undecided voters, as they will decide the election, not registered Democrats or Republicans?
Well, it is a good question, and I answered it probably more broadly than I should have. So let me be more specific. I don't believe, at least from the polling that I've seen over the last 2 days, and we'll see more in the days ahead as more reliable polling is done, I don't believe that any minds were changed, not among Democrats, not among Republicans, nor among independents. So we know, and we talked about this last week, that at this point, depending on the poll we look at, between 3 and 7% of the American people still say they're undecided in this election. I would be very surprised if those numbers changed as a result of Tuesday night, and we don't have any evidence that either Trump or Biden lost or gained any support from independents, regardless of where they lined up pre-election. In other words, they've been doing what they're doing, and there's precious few voters out there who saw or heard anything Tuesday night to change their mind, regardless of their party registration.
Thank you. Under what authority can RNC send poll watchers to polling stations?
Well, it's an excellent question. And for those of you who haven't watched it, I know, Jessica, you were going to remind us about this also. I had the privilege of having a fascinating conversation with California's Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, on Tuesday of this week. And I believe that video has been posted on the World Affairs Council Town Hall website. Is that right, Jessica?
Yes, it should be up on our YouTube channel, so you guys can watch it there, or if you go to our website, there's also links to watch it there too.
So specifically to the question, in almost every single state in the country, I think there's just a handful where this is not the case, is poll watchers, Republican or Democrat, have to go through a training process and a training program to learn about what they can and cannot do when they're acting as poll watchers. They're there to observe. They're there to make notes in case they see anything that they consider to be inappropriate or untoward, but they're not permitted to interfere in any way. There was a little bit of a dust up in Pennsylvania recently, which the president referenced during the debate on Tuesday night, in which a supporter of his showed up not on election day, but on a pre-election day vote center to act as an observer, and was asked to leave. And the primary reason for that is that this individual simply had not gone through the Pennsylvania state approved program. So for those of you who are comfortable doing so, and I know in a time of COVID, everyone wants to be careful, but for everyone who is comfortable doing so, if you'd like to be a poll watcher, the way to do it is to sign up for a training program. Otherwise, it's much more than likely, Democrat or Republican, if you show up on election day, you won't be permitted to stay.
Thank you so much. Nancy Pelosi said today that she expects the House of Representatives after January 3rd will not have a 26-state delegation majority for Republicans if the presidential election is thrown to the House. Trump seems to think that throwing the election to the House will keep him in power. What gives? So I don't know if this is your thoughts on Pelosi's approach versus Trump's approach.
Sure. So in the past, and I think most recently last week, we've talked about what happens if the election simply is not decided by the Electoral College, by the courts, or by the House of Representatives. What Pelosi and Trump have both raised in the last week is the steps that are taken if the Electoral College can't resolve the election. But before going to the steps I talked about last week, when the presidential succession kicks in, because what the Constitution says is if no candidate has 270 electoral votes, then Congress makes the decision. The House of Representatives for president and the Senate for vice president. This, of course, is an artifact to back when presidents and vice presidential candidates did not run on a ticket together and did not have to be of the same party. If the Electoral College ties 269 to 269, or more likely, one or more states have contested delegations, then the election goes to Congress. And as Jessica's question, the question that Jessica read noted, when the House of Representatives picks the president, they don't vote as individuals. It's not that there are 435 votes, of which Democrats obviously have the majority. Rather, each state delegation has one vote. And so California, 53 members, get one vote on who ought to be the president. Hawaii's or Rhode Island's or Montana's or Wyoming's delegation, they get one vote also. And as both Trump and Pelosi have correctly noted, currently the Republicans control 26 House delegations. And what Pelosi has said is that she believes, given likely House pickups this fall, that by January 3rd, when the new House of Representatives is sworn in, that Democrats will have control over more state House delegations than Republicans will. And in fact, she's asked the Democratic Congressional Committee to redirect its money to races in states where that balance of House seats is in question, states where they might not otherwise be spending money. Trump, for his part, asserts that Republicans currently have a larger number of states than Democrats and will continue to do so. But if the Democrats pick up seats on election day, as many pollsters expect them to do, that's not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination.
Thank you. I always like these questions. Were you the moderator, what strategy would you employ to manage the candidate's conduct? I always like putting you in the role of these important positions.
Well, for those of you who did not see it, Arnold Schwarzenegger, our former governor, tweeted out last night that if the moderator for the next debate would like him, that he, Arnold, was available to help enforce order. So that sounds awfully tempting to me. The debate commission, as many of you saw, yesterday announced that they would make some changes in the rules to try to keep the debate proceeding the way that it's intended to. I think a lot of smart people have pointed out that the rules are only helpful if both candidates agree to follow them, and that's obviously an open question. The question that's particularly intriguing to me is the idea of giving the moderator control of the candidate's microphones. And therefore, if a candidate goes over or interrupts, his or her microphone can be cut off. What I would do is actually take a step further. This isn't the role of the moderator to decide, but the role of the Presidential Commission on Debates. I would have it set up, so not giving the moderator the discretion, but just have it absolutely set up. So when the candidate is asked a question, his microphone goes on for 120 seconds and no more. And when that time period has elapsed, his microphone goes off. And so when his opponent is being asked a question, he simply does not have the ability to be heard at all. That could lead to some fairly entertaining visuals in the next debate. But from my perspective, just not playing favorites, not taking sides, but just regimenting it, saying you simply will not be heard because your microphone will be off during your opponent's answer, to me would go a long way, if not to establishing decorum, would at least allow both candidates to be heard in the way most of the voters would like.
Thank you. Have past debates removed the allotted time for the candidates to rebut comments made by others on stage when they are named or called out? This seemed to contribute to the yelling match when both Trump and Biden wanted to respond to the accusations of the other.
Yeah, I think it's a smart technique, but it does put an awful lot of pressure on the moderator, because the idea is if Jessica and I are debating, which by the way I would not be foolish enough to do, I'll just say, you're absolutely right, Jessica, and that would be the best way to proceed. But if I were to criticize her, or if I were to mention her by name or by implication, she would automatically be given 30 seconds to respond to that before the next question. And so let's say I decided to employ a very combative approach against Jessica because I knew otherwise I know there's no way I could defeat her. And I've referenced her 6 or 7 times in my own 2-minute response to the question the moderator put to me. Well, then even before Jessica got the next question, she would get 3 or 3.5 minutes to respond and rebut to my accusation. I think it's a good idea. I don't think it necessarily would have discouraged the president from being combative, but I think once he recognized the time imbalance beginning to develop, I think it might have led to a slightly less confrontational strategy.
Thank you. I would never debate you. I'd be terrified.
Terrified debaters, okay.
Yeah.
By the way, I should say in fairness, back to the last question for a moment, I singled out the president because analysis shows that he did it much more, but both candidates did interrupt each other. And so similarly, Trump would be given additional time when Biden referenced him or criticized him.
Yeah, thank you. This questioner says, I am terrified about violence on and after November 3rd. What do you think, or what do you predict? What needs to be done?
Okay. We're going to talk more about this as it gets closer to the election. And I think as we get closer to the election, we'll get very helpful guidance from local elected officials of both parties, depending on where we live, and from law enforcement and from election officials on how to best conduct ourselves. My instinct, and it's just an instinct, and I'll defer to appropriate authorities, of course, as we learn more about preparations that are being made to keep the kind of thing the questioner is worrying about from happening. My impression, particularly watching the protests and some of the unrest earlier this year, is that law enforcement gets in a more challenging situation when there are two sides agitating back and forth against each other. When only one side of an argument is on the street, it becomes much easier for, I think, law enforcement to handle the situation in a calmer and a more productive way. But when there are multiple moving parts is, I think, where it gets much more confusing and much more difficult. And my feeling is that because poll watchers of both parties need to be trained and certified, that those of us who'd be tempted to take to the streets on election day, even in opposition to protesters arguing for things that we find reprehensible, I think we should resist that impulse, because I think we need to make it as easy and as non-confusing as possible for election officials and law enforcement to perform their jobs in such a highly charged environment. The more of us there are out there, the more different types of things we're arguing and the more potential confrontations and conflicts there are, I think the more challenging it gets. Now, I say that as someone who has no law enforcement training and little election training. And like I said, as we get more guidance from appropriate authorities in the weeks ahead, I do think that because those of us who want calm instead of violence far outnumber those who want violence, that the more we can do to respect those kind of guidelines, the better off we are. In the meantime, though, and this is something I do feel much more comfortable offering my thoughts on, long before Election Day, and that's the question about what happens if the election results are not clear on election night. There's been public opinion polling that shows that the American public has been educating ourselves at admirable speed in recent weeks about the possibility that we will not have results on the evening of November 3rd, as we've become accustomed to during the modern television era. A poll that was taken in early August showed that roughly 30% of Americans felt that understood that the election results might not be available on election night, only 30%. As of a week or two ago, 70% of Americans understood that we might not have results that night, and it might be a day or days or even weeks before the results come through. Now, that's tremendous progress. That's really, really impressive, and I take great relief in it. But that still means that 3 out of every 10 Americans is expecting results on election night. And while I do think the news media, who I don't compliment all that often, are doing a good job of educating voters to that, given the change in poll numbers on that question of election results, I think the one thing we can all do in the weeks ahead is do everything we can to make sure that our friends, our neighbors, our family members, our work colleagues understand, regardless of whether you're voting for Trump or Biden, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat or Libertarian or Vegetarian, it's important to know, for as many of us as possible, to understand that the lack of definitive results on election night is not a call for panic or for outrage, but rather that our votes are being counted the way they should and carefully, rather than quickly. The more we can do between now and the morning of November 3rd to make sure that our fellow citizens and the members of our communities understand that, the more that's, I think, the most important thing that all of us can do to contribute to the likelihood of calm on the evening of November 3rd and in the days following.
Thank you. This person actually submitted a comment. Frank Luntz summed up results of his debate virtual focus group. Among undecided voters, the winner of the first debate was, "I might not vote." We need to consider turnout as part of electoral calculations. So do you think that's what we're going to see among undecided voters? And do you think we're going to have higher turnout for this election or lower turnout overall?
As all of you know by now, I'm loath to make predictions. And Jeff Sinclair got me this wonderful mug saying no to predictions, yes to coffee. Even though I'll confide in you guys that it's water in there, it's not caffeine. So despite what I seem like, I'm not quite all that caffeinated. But I think Luntz's survey is probably right. An undecided voter would be particularly likely to have been discouraged by what he or she saw in the first debate. That said, while I don't make predictions, I think it's reasonable to expect an extremely high turnout in this election, even given the pandemic. In 2018, we saw historically high turnout, probably the highest turnout for midterm elections in roughly a century. And in fact, the turnout in 2018 was close to the levels that we normally see in presidential years. So it's reasonable to assume that we will see an even higher turnout this year. But this gets back to something we talked about earlier in the program today and have been talking about for months now. The campaign is essentially a contest at this point to see whether Trump or Biden can motivate their respective bases of supporters to a greater degree. Both campaigns are working feverishly to turn out voters who are aligned with them, who might not have turned out in 2016. And so while Luntz's poll of specifically of undecided voters certainly shows some discouragement, I think among the 93 to 97% of Americans who have made up their mind, and the more who will, not only are they going to be very motivated on the natural to turn out, but both parties are working overtime to do everything they can to motivate them even further.
Thank you. A lot of people asked about debate fact checking, why it isn't a requisite and if it should be. Could you comment on that?
Well, the fact checking is I think is a really tricky question. Some of you may remember that in 2012, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were debating, and Romney made a charge or an assertion about something that Obama had done or had not done. And Candy Crowley from CNN, who's moderating the debate, I think one of the finest journalists in America, corrected Romney and said, "No, Governor, that's not true." And you could see that Romney was sort of confused on that, because as it turned out, Crowley was wrong and Romney was right. And there was Romney trying to figure out, does he get into a back and forth with the moderator? Does he defend his position? Does he go on? And so I think you're putting an extraordinary amount of pressure on a single human being in real time to fact check both candidates. We have teams of observers, journalists and others, who are doing that fact checking in real time from off stage. And what any number of media organizations have done is they've been posting those fast fact checks in real time. The one I'd point you to in particular that I thought was especially impressive is the one run by USA Today. They did a phenomenal job. CNN does a great job. The Washington Post fact checkers are excellent, but there's plenty of others. So to me, rather than having the moderator correcting the candidates, which I think really does disrupt the debate and take time away from them, I think in that case, you're putting the moderator in a somewhat unfair, an unwinnable situation. So I think what a voter can do who wants that information at hand can log in and find it from sources that aren't trying to moderate the debate at the same time.
Yeah, that would be a very ambitious task to try to be doing all of that at once. What is the percentage of Democrats who did not vote for Hillary Clinton or because of their dislike of her voted for Trump? Isn't this the group that Biden needs to win back?
That is a group that Biden needs to win back, and it's almost certainly one of the most important ones. What we're seeing in public opinion polls now is that roughly 8% of Trump voters have indicated from 2016 have indicated that they will vote for Biden this fall. 2% of Clinton voters have indicated that they will vote for Biden. And so when you see Biden talking about his roots in Scranton, Pennsylvania, when you see him talking about working class voters, that's exactly the voting bloc he's reaching out to. Those white working class voters, largely from small town and rural America. And at least right now, both nationally and in the key swing states, it appears that Biden is winning those votes back. Interestingly, even among white working class voters, just like there is in the electorate overall, the gender gap is immense. Trump is still winning among working class white male voters by a very, very large margin. But among females from that same demographic, the two are virtually tied. And that's an immense shift in Biden's direction from what Clinton was able to achieve 4 years ago.
Thank you so much. This questioner says, attacking Judge Barrett in the confirmation hearings is a horrible strategy by Democrats. Do you agree?
I think it's risky. I think what the Democrats understand is, on one hand, the Barrett confirmation discussion provides them with a phenomenal opportunity to motivate their base. And you saw Biden on Tuesday night, and you've heard him and many other leading Democrats over the last several days attempting to link her confirmation to the elimination of the Affordable Care Act. And so they definitely see an opportunity to rally their own troops on this issue. But what they do have to be careful of, and I mentioned earlier Senator Feinstein's questioning of Barrett when she was in the process of being confirmed for her current position. While they're trying to motivate their own most loyal supporters, Democrats have to be very careful about not motivating or provoking Trump's most loyal supporters. And so very aggressive questioning about Barrett's religious faith could have the potential of rallying, of motivating, of motivating religious conservative voters to turn out for Trump. As I mentioned earlier, Trump has actually lost some support among evangelical and fundamentalist voters over the course of this year. He's lost a great deal of support compared to 2016, particularly among Catholic voters. And so I think the questioner is correct. Whether Democrats raise her religious beliefs or not in the context of public policy or not, I think it behooves them to do so in a very careful and cautious way, one, out of respect to somebody else's legitimate religious beliefs, but also because of the potential backlash that it might cause if they overstep.
Thank you. On the topic of her religious beliefs, this questioner has a long question. Barrett has written about recusal and beliefs. Her religious beliefs should not be denigrated, but she should be asked about her views on a Catholic's beliefs and recusal in light of her earlier expressed views. What are your thoughts on exploring recusal/religious beliefs? Also, your thoughts on her views about precedent. She has written about what is valid precedent and what is not real precedent, in part subject to popular acceptance.
So I think these last two questions have defined what might be a very smart strategy for Democrats in the Judiciary Committee hearings. Those two questions that we just heard don't even mention Barrett's own personal religious beliefs. But while one of the two generally mentions the religious beliefs of a judge, the other doesn't at all. So two really good questions. Number one, what does Barrett believe about whether a judge should recuse herself or himself from an issue based on religion? And that's based on a particular opinion she offered as it related to a death penalty case. And she suggested not that all Catholics, because of course the Catholic Church is against the death penalty. She did not suggest in her writing that all Catholic judges should always recuse themselves from all death penalty cases. What she said instead was that this particular judge who is hearing a case, who had spoken out very aggressively in public about his discomfort and his opposition to the death penalty, he should recuse himself, not necessarily because of his religious belief, but because of the public advocacy role he had taken on regarding the issue as a result of his religious belief. And I think that is, I'm not taking sides in this, but I think that is a distinction worth considering. Whether you agree with her or not, it is different than saying no Catholic should ever rule on this issue. As far as precedent, Barrett has written quite a bit over the years, suggesting that while the U.S. Supreme Court should respect prior decisions whenever possible, and she made it clear when she was being confirmed for the appellate court that the appellate court should almost always respect Supreme Court precedent. She's made it clear that if a Supreme Court does feel that its predecessors have made a fundamentally erroneous decision, that they do have the ability to overturn it. And in her writing, the language she's used has caused a lot of people to believe she'd be much more willing to overturn previous court decisions than many other justices have been. The people who agree with her will point to a case like Plessy versus Ferguson, which the courts should have overruled. Those who disagree with her talk about what a relatively unique exception that is, and the importance of establishing a reliable case of law is an obligation of the court. I suspect that if the Democrats handle this well, both of those questions can come up without necessarily getting into questions about her own specific religious leanings.
Thank you. Why won't Biden release his list of potential Supreme Court nominees before the election? Is this out of the ordinary for a candidate?
Biden won't release his list of judges because he knows it will make people mad. Trump knows that he knew in 2016 that the way he could win was by motivating his base to turn out and didn't really worry that much about swing voters. Biden, on the other hand, both needs his base to turn out and he needs to reach out to voters in the political center. I think Biden knows that once he starts naming names about judges that he might consider, that's either going to disappoint or infuriate either the political left or the political center. So it's a no-win for him. How frequent is it not to release names like that? In fact, Donald Trump is the only major party nominee in modern American history who has released a list of potential judicial appointments. So Trump very much is a unique specimen in this regard. Biden's decision not to do so, well, clearly for political purposes, is much more in the tradition of prior nominees of both parties.
Thank you. And I think this will be our final question. The questioner says, what I don't understand about the rush to approve Barrett before the election is that it would appear that the battle has been won and they don't need to re-elect the president. What are your thoughts on that?
A very smart strategic question. And in fact, in the first couple of days after Justice Ginsburg's death, this was an argument that was raging, apparently, not only but within the Republican Party, but within the Trump White House. And a lot of people argued, a lot of the president's supporters argued, as did the questioner, that rather than confirming the new justice and having it as a done deal, is making it a motivational tool to urge supporters to turn out on election day. In other words, we haven't done it yet, but if you re-elect the president and if you re-elect a Republican Senate majority, then we'll be able to get it done then. And I think what the president and his advisors and Senator McConnell in particular realized is that while that could be a smart motivational strategy, it would just be way too risky. As I said earlier, while there's no way to know for sure, it's entirely possible that a senator running in a difficult re-election campaign right now, someone like Senator Gardner from Colorado, Senator McCollum from Arizona, might decide after the election, if they've lost, well, I'm not going back to the Senate anyway. Why should I vote for this person under such difficult circumstances? And McConnell, who, if anything, is a very, very, very cautious vote counter, simply doesn't want to run that risk. So the motivational aspect, as the questioner suggested, is an enticing one. But waiting until post-election, it does appear that Republicans have decided that that is just too great a gamble.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. I'm sorry that we're out of time, but thank you for all of that. And Kim, I'm going to turn the conversation back over to you.
Dan, thank you again. Your thoughtful, well-informed discussions through this politics in the time of coronavirus, and also all of your great moderations that you've done with all these other great speakers really help us figure out what's going on and how to navigate through these challenging times. So thank you so very much. And for those of you who can't get enough of Dan, we have a special offer for our members. Today, in fact, we do this every other Thursday. We do a go-to-meeting with Dan following today's discussion, and that format enables you to talk directly to Dan and ask questions of him. And if that's something that's of interest to you, please go to our website and sign up as a member, and you can join us in 2 weeks for another in-depth discussion with Dan to get so informed.
And if I may, Kim, what's great about those discussions for me is while I really enjoy Jessica's ability to summarize the questions that come in writing, what I really love about our post-game show is it's actually a conversation where instead of doing it in writing, we're all on screen talking to each other and going back and forth, and that's a lot of fun.
We're trying to simulate what many of you enjoyed as our private special roundtables where you got to engage directly with the speakers. So until we can get back to our in-person events, I think that's a really good opportunity. So again, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider helping us keep these wonderful programs going. Please text the word Schnur, so appropriate, to the number on the screen and give what you can. Every little bit helps, and we appreciate it so much. We have a terrific lineup of programs for you. October 6th, a conversation with Pete Buttigieg. On October 13th, the swing states of the 2020 election. This is part of our 2020 election series. We've got Ron Brownstein on October 20th, who will be talking about who will be deciding the presidential election. And then October 27th, how media will influence the election. And of course, every Thursday, politics in the time of coronavirus with Dan, to help us navigate through these crazy news cycles. So everybody, please stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you soon. And take care. Dan.